In this video, we address the possibilities of who might have written the Gospel of John and when they might have written the Gospel of John. I'm not going to come to a firm conclusion as to our different options about who the author of John might be. I will leave that to you to do on your own between the readings for the week and between what you see here in this video. As a forenote here, we're going to be looking at I'm going to be providing a lot of references to the Gospel of John, to specific passages, without actually looking at those passages. So if there are particular topics or if there's something that particularly piques your interest, I strongly encourage you to have your Bible handy as you watch this video, and very much feel free to pause and go and look at the reference from the Gospel of John so you can sort of see what I'm talking about when I make reference to these passages. So we're going to start with the authorship of the Gospel of John, which is technically speaking anonymous, like all of the other synoptic Gospels are. It doesn't state who its author is, but it does give us some hints about the author's identity, and even more so than the other Gospels do, so that we have the sense that the author of the Gospel of John is a figure in the Gospel called the beloved disciple. And we have a couple of different options about who this beloved disciple might be. The first and the traditional view of authorship of the Gospel of John is that the Apostle John, who is the son of Zebedee, who shows up in the Gospel, is the author of the Gospel of John. The next position that we'll lay out some evidence for is Lazarus, who also shows up in the Gospel. And the last one is what is called the Johannine community. And this last position has been sort of the favored position in especially the second half of the 20th century. And so we're going to start, before moving to each of these possible figures, we're going to start by looking at what it is we can know about the author of the Gospel of John from the Gospel of John itself. So what things internal to the Gospel is suggested about this author. This author seems to know Jewish festivals and traditions quite well. And I give you some different references here to John 2, 6, 7, 10, and 19. And we'll look at some of these here. So now standing there were 6 stone jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. So this is from John 6, when Jesus is going to change water into wine. And sort of archaeological finds of these jars have confirmed that of course, that these jars were used for Jewish purification rites, but also the volume of the jars, that the author seems to know the approximate volume of these purification jars and what they hold. And you can see, if you want to go on your own to these other references to Jewish festivals and traditions, that the author of John shows knowledge of. The author is also going to introduce and explain Hebrew and Aramaic words on occasions. So I give you a couple different references here. 3 different ones from John chapter 1 and 1 reference from John chapter 20. We'll look at the one from 138. Rabbi is translated. Rabbi, which means teacher. Of course, we sort of really well know that rabbi means teacher in our own context, but John is going to go ahead and define it for John's audience. And the author John also shows knowledge not only of Palestinian geography, but particularly of Jerusalem. And the author of John shows knowledge of the geography of Jerusalem better than the authors of the Synoptic Gospels do. So I give you here some references from John 4, from John chapter 9, and from John chapter 10. The one from John chapter 9 is specifically related to Jerusalem, where Jesus commands a healed person to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And this pool of Siloam is a real live place in the city of Jerusalem. So here I give you a map of Jerusalem. And if you see my cursor here, our Siloam pool is going to be right down here. So a real thing, real place that existed in Jerusalem. that the author of John seems to have been familiar with. And so then the conclusion here is that not only is the author probably Jewish, has familiarity with Jewish festivals, traditions, and Jerusalem, but is also sort of outward looking. The fact that he not only introduces Hebrew and Aramaic words, but translates them suggests that he has an eye also to a non-Jewish audience. So we have a Jewish author, probably someone who lives close to Jerusalem or who has spent significant amount of time in Jerusalem, but has an interest in not only writing for a Jewish audience, but also for a Gentile audience. So in that first slide, I had mentioned that the beloved disciple is the figure who is in the gospel itself, that is the author of the gospel. That the Gospel of John is going to tell us that the beloved disciple is the one who wrote these things. And so it will behoove us to know some things about the beloved disciple and look at those places where the beloved disciple shows up in the Gospel of John. So you'll see this translated either as the disciple whom Jesus loved when you read the Gospel of John, or as the beloved disciple. So here we're just going to zoom in on each one of these references in order that all occur after John chapter 13, or starting in John chapter 13. So notice that the beloved disciple does not appear in the first half of the Gospel of John. So the first occurrence is in John chapter 13, where Jesus and his disciples are reclining at table, and they are asking who it is that is going to betray Jesus. And the beloved disciple is reclining next to Jesus at this point. So there's this sort of close physical proximity at the Last Supper of the beloved disciple to Jesus. And this is to emphasize, as we'll see happens a couple more times, the closeness of Jesus and the beloved disciple, particularly also in contexts where Simon Peter also shows up. So that we have the beloved disciple, Simon Peter, and Jesus sort of next to each other. And it seems like sometimes the beloved disciple and Peter are sort of in competition with one another with respect to their closeness to Jesus. So our next example here is from John chapter 18, where the beloved disciple shows up once again with Simon Peter. So Simon Peter and another disciple are following Jesus. And since that disciple was known to the high priest, he goes in with Jesus into the courtyard when the high priest is going to question Jesus. But Peter stands outside at the gate. So that other disciple, the beloved disciple, gets to go in with Jesus, sort of gets this privileged, to be in a privileged space with Jesus. And Peter is left on the outside. In John chapter 19, we have Jesus seeing his mother and the disciple whom Jesus loved standing beside her at the crucifixion scene. And Jesus tells his mother, "Woman, here is your son," making this sort of close familial connection with the beloved disciple and Jesus. And then in John chapter 20, I'm not going to read this one in its entirety. This one has been cheekily dubbed the theological foot race, where Peter and the beloved disciple race to the tomb after Mary comes and tells them about the resurrection. And the beloved disciple, in sort of characteristically Johannine fashion, outdoes Peter by running faster than him to the tomb. He gets there first. And then in John chapter 21, we have Jesus appearing to the disciples. He asks them, you don't have any fish, do you? And they answer him, no. He tells them to cast to the other side. Peter, or the beloved disciple, tells Peter that it's Jesus. The beloved disciple recognizes Jesus first, before Peter does, tells Peter that it's Jesus, and then Peter famously hurls himself into the sea naked and swims over to Jesus. And then again, we have John chapter 21. This one's particularly important, so I'm going to read it in its entirety here. So Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus didn't say that he would not die, but "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. So here in John chapter 21, we have the claim that the beloved disciple is the one who wrote down the things that are recorded in the Gospel of John. We also have this in this passage, this reminder of the beloved disciple being close to Jesus at the Last Supper. We also, again, have this relationship with John and Peter. And we also have this bit about a rumor being spread that the beloved disciple would not die until the Parousia, until Jesus returned. And so all of this is going to be important in just a second when we get to our different options about who the beloved disciple might be. These sort of different things about the disciple's identity. And so what we're going to do is go through each one of our options here. So our first option is a figure named John, and we have 3 different Johns that show up in the New Testament. We, of course, have John the Baptist, who baptizes Jesus. This is not the John we're talking about. We have John the Seer, namely the author of the book of Revelation, which we'll get to later in this semester. This is also not the John that we are talking about. And then we have John the Apostle. This is the John who is our option for an author of the Gospel of John. And this is, as I said earlier in this video, sort of the historical testimony to or the traditional position on the authorship of the Gospel of John. And we find it as early as the 2nd century with Irenaeus in Against Heresies. He says, "Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast," so remember recalling that bit from John chapter 21, "did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia." So this is the traditional position. John the Apostle is the author, and he writes his gospel or publishes his gospel at Ephesus. So our sort of points in contention, or our points of evidence for John being the author of the Gospel of John, is that John is, of course, a close associate of Jesus, along with James and Peter. And this is true especially in the Synoptic Gospels. And being a close associate of Jesus makes John also a close associate of Peter. And then we're also going to see that this is true in the book of Acts as well. So there's this relationship between Jesus, John, and Peter, but also between John and Peter, which might make sense of some of those places where the beloved disciple shows up sort of in this relationship with Peter. But the fact is that John is never mentioned by name in this particular gospel. John doesn't really show up prominently in the Gospel of John, except in the figure of the beloved disciple. So the only way we sort of see John in the Gospel of John is as the beloved disciple. That John doesn't have a prominent role in the Gospel of John as he does in the Synoptic Gospels, where he's, for example, present at the transfiguration of Jesus. So then some evidence against the traditional position that John the Apostle is the author of the 4th Gospel. Again, John is never mentioned by name. Oh, and I should go back and say that on this previous slide, this is a point in favor of John being an author of the 4th Gospel because of the anonymity of the Gospels. That all 4 Gospels are anonymous, and they want to sort of, it seems, remove, they don't want to claim authorship. That whoever wrote these Gospels very well could have said, "I, so-and-so, wrote this Gospel," and the fact that John has maybe removed himself from the gospel altogether by name might be a point in favor of John writing this gospel. That because John features prominently in the synoptics and is sort of erased from the Gospel of John, might be because John is intentionally writing himself out of this gospel, not to toot his own horn, but to put the emphasis on the importance of Jesus himself. And so we can take this both ways. The fact that John is also never mentioned in the gospel might also indicate that this person is not at all important for the fourth gospel. And then we also have these key events. I already mentioned the transfiguration, these key events from the synoptic gospels wherein John is actually present. They don't occur in the Gospel of John. So the transfiguration, the raising of Jairus' daughter, and in the Garden of Gethsemane, these events aren't narrated in the Gospel of John, but they are in the Synoptic Gospels, and John is there at those events in the Synoptic Gospels. And then the fact that the beloved disciple does not appear until John 13. He sort of comes out of nowhere, whereas in the synoptics, John is one of the first called disciples, that John plays, a role from the beginning of Jesus's ministry, not just starting towards sort of the second half of it as Jesus is moving towards Jerusalem in the Passion narrative. So our next option here is Lazarus. And to me, this is, if it's not the most convincing, it's at least the most interesting option. So we're introduced to Lazarus at John chapter 11. And I'm going to go ahead and read this out for us here. We have John 11:5. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So notice what we have here. We have the verb loved, which is, common enough in the Gospel of John, as we learned in that last video. But we have this explicit statement that Jesus loved Lazarus. So the beloved disciple, Jesus loved Lazarus. There's a connection there, perhaps. And then our next bit here from verses 32 through 36. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. My brother, namely Lazarus. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in his spirit and deeply moved. He said, Where have you laid Lazarus? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep, so the Jews said, See how he loved him. So on another occasion here, we have explicitly Jesus loving Lazarus. Lazarus being the object of Jesus's love, the beloved disciple being the one who writes the Gospel of John. And then from John chapter 12, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of them at table with him. So Lazarus shows up again after being raised from the dead. So Lazarus sort of rejoins Jesus's cohort after having died and being raised from the dead. So to put these some of this into our positive evidence that perhaps Lazarus is the author of the fourth gospel, we have these statements that Jesus loved Lazarus, and the introduction of the beloved disciple comes right after, or very closely after, the introduction of Lazarus in John chapter 11. So the beloved disciple, remember, first shows up in John chapter 13. Lazarus is introduced in John chapter 11. So maybe this close proximity of Lazarus to the beloved disciple in the narrative indicates something. And then, as we saw with our slide about the passages about the beloved disciple, there was this rumor that the beloved disciple would not die, partially on account of what Jesus said, but perhaps that rumor also might have been fueled by the fact that Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And then the beloved disciple sees Jesus's grave clothes in John chapter 20. So when the beloved disciple and Peter race to Jesus's grave, the beloved disciple gets there first. He peers into the grave and he sees Jesus's grave clothes. And the word for the grave clothes there are the same word for grave clothes. Excuse me, I'm misspeaking here. That the idea is then that it's not that there's a similar word between Lazarus's grave clothes and Jesus's grave clothes, but it's the fact that Lazarus would have had on his own grave clothes. And so there's a connection. It's kind of odd that in John chapter 20, Lazarus looks in and he sees grave clothes, perhaps sort of hearkening back to Lazarus's own resurrection from the dead. And then Lazarus was a Judean, appears to have lived near Jerusalem, which would explain the knowledge of Jerusalem, but also the fact that Lazarus is a Jew who's translating or including Hebrew and Aramaic words into the fourth gospel. And our last sort of most popular amongst the scholars option is what is called the Johannine community, that we don't necessarily have one single author of the Gospel of John, but the Gospel of John is sort of a communal project that is written and published over time in different stages. And so when we look at John 20, 30 through 31, another very key verse for understanding the purpose and the authorship of John, it says that Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which aren't written in this book, but these things are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. So the very purpose of the writing of the Gospel of John is belief. The question is then, that sounds a whole lot like the ending of the Gospel of John, but then the Gospel of John is going to continue on for another chapter. And this is sort of indicative of some different literary themes that we see throughout the Gospel of John, where the Gospel appears to sort of have been stitched together out of different literary materials. So we see some of these other themes at the beginning of John chapter 15, where in John 14:31, Jesus says, "Get up, let us go," after just finishing speaking, and then launches into another speaking discourse. So it seems that what comes in John 15 has been added to what was already sort of ended in John 14:31, that you would expect Jesus, after he says, "Get up, let us go," to actually leave and go, but then he just keeps on teaching. So the idea is that the literary material, the teaching, has just sort of been stitched in to what comes at the end of John chapter 14 and hasn't sort of been elegantly interweaved with one another. You can sort of still see that seam in the narrative. And so we see similar seams at John chapter 11, verse 2, and chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. And so the idea here is that we have multiple editions or multiple pieces of literature that were used in a community. This also sort of makes sense of the conflict with Jews in the synagogue in the Gospel of John, that phrase, "out of the synagogue," that if we have a community using sort of Jesus literature, that they eventually bring this literature together to form one single coherent gospel. This also makes sense of John being intentionally anonymous. If you're writing for a community, or if a community is writing, not one figurehead is going to take credit for that writing. It also makes sense of the beloved disciple sort of standing in contrast to Peter, that if we have sort of Petrine Christianity, where Peter seems to be a figurehead or a very important figure for a one group of the early Jesus movement, perhaps that this sort of conflict with Peter and the beloved disciple shows another figurehead. It will also make sense of the sort of radical differences between John and the synoptics, where in the synoptics, Peter, of course, figures quite prominently. And so what we find is that when we look at the beloved disciple's responses to Jesus are always praiseworthy. The beloved disciple really looks like this sort of ideal follower of Jesus. And so then the idea is that John is presenting the beloved disciple, the author of John, the Johannine community, is presenting the beloved disciple as an ideal follower of Jesus that the audience of the gospel is supposed to mimic. So those are our three different options. We have John the Apostle, we have Lazarus, we have the Johannine community. Other options have been argued as well, but those are sort of the three main ones. And I would really say 1 and 3 are the main ones. And Lazarus is the one that's sort of the bonus, more interesting argument, in my opinion. But so let's move from authorship onto the date and location of the Gospel of John. So we see these literary themes in the Gospel. So when we're talking about the publication or the writing of the Gospel of John, we're normally talking about the final version of it, the version of it that we have and that we are reading in our own Bibles. So normally the Gospel of John is said to be dated a little bit later, to 90 to 100 CE, after the Synoptic Gospels. And one of the reasons that that puts our dating not later than 100 is what is called P52 or Papyrus 52, also called the John Rylands manuscript. And here is a fragment of it. And this manuscript has been dated to the first half of the 2nd century CE, so before 150 CE. The idea then that if we have a copy of the Gospel of John sort of out there, and this would not be thought of as the original copy of the Gospel of John, but sort of the Gospel of John has been copied and has gotten out into circulation by 150 CE. The idea is then that that we obviously can't have something later than that, but we also have to have time for that circulation. So that this puts our dating of when the gospel couldn't have been written after to around 100 CE. This would also sort of the 90 to 100 CE date also sort of makes sense of this out of the synagogue business, that the longer we have, so that if we have, a few decades after Mark was written and we start to see more of a parting of the ways between the Jesus movement and early Christians and early Judaism, that maybe the Gospel of John is showing something later, a more of a divergence that has happened over a longer period of time, which gets us later on than 70 CE as we have the dating for the Gospel of Mark. And so here I give us again, remember these are the places where the author mentions out of the synagogue, that there's this sort of connection between believing in Jesus and being kicked out of the synagogue. And as to location goes, really we're sort of we're left guessing in many ways. The traditional location is Ephesus. We saw this with Irenaeus' testimony and against heresies. And to give you a sense of where Ephesus is here, we have, you can see my cursor, we have Ephesus in what is called Asia Minor. So remember when we're talking about where Jesus was and what he was doing, we have him down here in Galilee and in Jerusalem. We have talked about the Gospel of Matthew perhaps being written from a city like Antioch, so it's showing some sort of spread of the gospel movement to Antioch, and then further out with the Gospel of John to Ephesus here. Ephesus is going to be an important crossroads in the ancient world with a fairly large population. It's also going to have a significant Jewish population, which makes it sort of at least a feasible option for the Gospel of John to be written from. Beyond this, we don't have much of a sense of where the gospel might have been written besides the familiarity with Jerusalem. So that familiarity with Jerusalem might also put the author in Judea. But at the end of the day, there's no necessarily strong evidence for one location or another for the writing of the Gospel of John.